Good evening, and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. Tonight is Thursday night, February 20th, 2025. Today, the Jewish people, Israel, we are heartbroken with the return of bodies from Gaza. And we are confused. We do not actually know what's going on as of just a few moments ago. News came out. I will just say this. The Bibas family announced earlier that they ask everyone to desist from any kind of memorial or mentioning or guessing before there is official information from the coroner, and they have asked that we not discuss this and not hypothesize about what's going on. And I want to respect their wishes, only to say that we are heartbroken and we do not know what the situation is at this moment. It will become clear. But we are a broken people tonight. I plan tomorrow morning at our 10 at 9 to discuss this further, although that depends on developments overnight. And I also plan to address this at ADATH on Shabbos. But in the respecting the wishes of the Bibas family, I will leave this subject for now, other than to say, we are heartbroken. One of the most famous and misunderstood passages in the Torah is in our Torah portion. The Torah says, "V'chi yinatzu anashim," when people fight with each other and one person injures the other, ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. If the aggressor, God forbid, put out the eye of the person they were fighting with, then we put out the eye of the aggressor. Similarly with a tooth, a hand, a foot, etc. Whatever the aggressor did to the victim, that's what we do, that's the punishment, that's what we do to the aggressor. That's a very strict, and some would say barbaric, punishment for the crime of assault. But we insist that the Torah from God comes in two parts. There is Torah Shebiksav, the written law, and Torah Shebal Peh, the oral law, and both are given by God through Moshe to the Jewish people. So one written, that's what we call the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, and one oral. So the written law says, ayin tachas ayin, we put out the eye of the person who put out the eye of another person. And the oral law says, mammon, we pay a financial penalty. Now, we reject what many others assert, that the written law, the Torah Shebiksav, is harsh. It comes from God who is harsh, and God says, ayin tachas ayin, put out his eye. But later, the rabbis who were more humane and had more of a sense of human dignity, later they changed that to the punishment of a monetary crime. You pay a certain amount of money. We reject that. Both the written law and the oral law are from God at Sinai to Moshe, to the Jewish people. Both are given concurrently. Well, if that's true, why? Why are there two versions of what the punishment for assault should be? Why write it one way if actually God wants us to do it another way? So one answer that I'd like to share with you this evening is it's like this in order to teach us two lessons. One is a lesson about an idea, and that comes from the written law, and the other is a lesson in practice that comes from the oral law. And it goes like this. And I want to make it clear, both of these ideas are crucial to us. And what I'm going to share with you, part of it is based on what I heard from my friend, Abe Mesrich. When you injure someone else, the legal punishment, which is mammon, there's a monetary punishment, that is in order to compensate for the damage that you caused to the victim. To pay for the doctor bills, to pay for the loss of wages that person will incur, to pay for their reduced earning power going forward if it's a permanent injury, to pay for the loss of dignity that they suffered when you assaulted them. But part of your penalty is not only compensating the person you hurt, but also healing yourself. And to do that, you have to feel their pain. All too often, disassociating ourselves from someone else's pain is what allows us to hurt them. Just to take extreme examples of anti-Semitic violence, racial violence, violent hate crimes, are often preceded by cartoons and images and rhetoric that dehumanizes the other. And if they are somehow less human than me, well, therefore, causing them pain is somehow okay. It is a sick, twisted logic, but tragically, it is very enduring. If you hurt someone, God's message is the court will require you to pay for their complete healing and compensation. But the message is also read the words as written in the Chumash, ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. We're not going to do this to you. But you should think about what it would feel like if this harm was done to me. If my eye, God forbid, was put out, what would I feel? And so the message of the written word is to work on yourself, the aggressor, to feel the pain of others. That along with the financial penalty is what justice requires in order for the victim to be healed and compensated, and in order for the aggressor to be healed. God insists that justice requires you cannot hurt someone else and not feel their pain. And that's why what is actually a financial penalty is described in the written Torah as ayin tachas ayin. Let's take a wider view of this. Why does the legal system present it like this? Why not write down both lessons? Why is one written and one oral with the insistence, remember our insistence, that both are contemporaneous and from God? Why not just write both of those lessons down in the written Torah? I have the privilege to teach Talmudic law at McGill University Faculty of Law. And this is part of a lesson that I always include in my course. So if the actual punishment is monetary, why write it to say eye for an eye, Why not write both of those lessons in the Torah? There's several answers to that question. The Siporno says that by all rights, we should take out your eye. That's what justice requires, and that's why it's written like that in the written law. But to do so would make us cruel. It would make us inured to, or even get pleasure from someone else's suffering. We, as human beings, are not capable of imposing that punishment without being affected negatively by it. And so the Torah teaches us, by writing one way and explaining it the other way, by the gap between the two, that whenever we judge, we must watch out for what it makes us become. It is a lesson for the judges. It's a lesson for the participants in the legal system. We have to look out for, what does it do to us? What does it make us into? And this is one example of many, and we've discussed this theme before, that law is not only about rules, consequences of our actions, it's also about values. In other words, law exists not only to learn how to treat the perpetrator, but also values that apply to everyone, including the judges. What kind of person should we try to be? What feelings should we have, and what feelings should we not have? What we should value and prioritize. These are values that are not written, they're not concrete, but they are just as much a part of law as the rules and punishments that are written and concrete. This is true in every legal system. I'll give you an example. One example of this is tax law. The tax code is where we as a society express our values and priorities. For example, here in Canada, in Quebec, we pay higher taxes for universal health care, for generous maternity leave, for generous child benefit. That is what we in Canada, in Quebec, we as a society hold as a priority. And so we advantage that within the tax code. I'll share another example. Privileged conversations. If a person speaks to a clergy, like a rabbi or a priest, about a troubling matter for counseling, or a person speaks to a lawyer, or a person speaks to a doctor, those conversations are privileged. The rabbi, the lawyer, the doctor is not allowed to reveal whatever was said. And by creating that law, by imposing that law, we are saying that as a society, our society is better off ensuring that people can speak openly and freely to a rabbi or a lawyer or a doctor, and that's more important than having access to the truth. These are values that are as much a part of law as the rules and penalties. And that dual nature of law applies to every mitzvah in the Torah. For example, let's talk for a moment about Shabbos. To observe Shabbos, there are rules, what to do, what not to do, and those are concrete, they're written. And then there are values, such as the spirit of Shabbos. There are certain activities that may not violate any specific concrete rule, but they will still be prohibited as they violate the spirit of Shabbos. And that affects things like how we dress, what we eat, how we spend our free time on Shabbos. I'll give you an example. Let's say it's Shabbos, and you're walking down the street, and you pass a store window, and in the window of this store is a television that's playing a football game. So anybody walking by the sidewalk can see what's happening on the television through the window. Is it permissible to stand on the sidewalk and watch? Well, what I would say is there may not be a rule that I can point to in a book that permits or prohibits it, but if it impacts on the spirit of Shabbos, which is holiness, it is still part of the laws of Shabbos, and it is prohibited. Now, in this example of observing Shabbos, clearly this is indicated in the Torah with two verses. One verse that we'll read later in the Torah, Shamar es Yom HaShabbos HaKadosh, guard the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Guard it, protect against violating any of the rules. Observe it carefully. And then there's the verse that we read in last week's Torah portion, Zachar es Yom HaShabbos HaKadosh. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Remember it, meaning be aware on Shabbos that there's a certain spirit of Shabbos, and that spirit is what leads to holiness. That's what Shabbos is supposed to mean by observing it, that we remember, that we are aware of the holiness of the day. Now, ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye, is a dramatic example where the written law and the oral law are contradictory. They contradict each other. But the purpose is to show both the rule, what happens to a person, and the value, how you should feel about it. And this double aspect of law applies to every mitzvah. What must I do or not do? And what happens if I violate it? That's one layer. And the other layer is, what kind of person is this law supposed to make me into? What values do I derive from it? And as we learn any law, any mitzvah in the Torah, we should seek to understand both of these components. Gathered around Mount Sinai in anticipation of hearing God reveal the Ten Commandments, the Aseret Dibros. The Jewish people say, the words are in our Torah portion, the Parsha Mishpatim. Vayomru kol ha'am. I'm sorry. Vayomru, and they said, the Jewish people said, Kol asher diber Hashem, naseh v'nishma. Everything that God says, naseh v'nishma. We will do it, and we will hear it. Naseh v'nishma. These words, naseh v'nishma, by which the Jewish people accepted the covenant with God, are among the most famous words in all of Jewish literature, Jewish thought. And they attest to a great merit of the Jewish people that they said these words, naseh v'nishma. The Talmud says, Rabbi Simloi said, when the Jewish people rushed to say, we will do naseh, before saying we will hear nishma, naseh v'nishma, naseh comes first, 600,000 ministering angels came down and fastened 2 crowns on each person. One is a reward for saying we will do, naseh, and the other is a reward for saying we will hear, nishma. Rabbi Eliezer said, when the Jewish people rushed to say we will do before saying we will hear, a divine voice went forth and said, who has revealed to my children this secret, which only the ministering angels make use of? God was so impressed and so happy that we said these words, Nasa v'nishma. Okay. But let's try to understand what the words actually mean. Well, Nasa is rather straightforward. Nasa means we will do. So it's about action. It's about behavior. We will observe the command. We will do the mitzvahs. We will observe the commandments. Straightforward. Nishma is not so straightforward. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs observes, and we've discussed this before, the word nishma, to hear, like the word Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. The meaning of that word nishma has different interpretations. It could mean we will hear, like I can hear something with my ear. It could also mean we will obey. I hear you, meaning I'm going to obey what you said. And it could also mean I understand. I hear you. I understand what you're saying. So clearly there is more than one way to understand what this phrase means. We know it's important. We know the Jewish people were rewarded for it. But in terms of what it means, it's not. There are going to be multiple opinions. For example, the Talmud says, and Rashi quotes this, we will do, naseh, we will do, and then we will hear. In other words, we agree to doing everything that God says before we even know what it is, because we have complete trust in God. God has proven that whatever God says is in our best interests. So therefore, we are willing to say we do whatever you want us to do before we even know what it is, because we are certain that whatever God would command will be good for us, will be in our best interests. That's the Talmud. Rashbam, one of the medieval commentators, says, Naseh means we will do what we have already been commanded. The nishma, and we will observe all of the future commandments that we learn about. In other words, according to Rashbam, this is a statement about the past and the future. We are going to do everything that we know about so far, and we are going to also observe what we will learn about in the future. In other words, the Jewish people understood that they were on a journey, not just a geographical, physical journey, but also a spiritual journey, and they were going to learn more as they go along. Siporno says, Naseh v'nishma is a single idea expressed by two words. We will do it obediently. In other words, we will do what you command because you asked us to do it. Not because of any other reason, but simply because we want to do your will. Naseh v'nishma, we're doing it because we want to fulfill your will. And finally, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama writes, we will do and we will understand. And he explains that there are certain things that you can only completely understand them once you have done them. Before you've actually done it, it remains theoretical. Doing something leads to a fuller understanding of what that action is. Now, in just a couple of minutes, we're going to discuss the curious fact that the narrative of the revelation at Sinai is told in two separate places. It's told in last week's Torah portion, the Parsha of Yisro, in chapter 19, and then it's told in this week's Torah portion, the Parsha of Mishpatim, in chapter 24. So we're going to discuss that in just a couple of moments. But before we get to that, there are three different verses where the Jewish people accept the covenant. And the wording is slightly different in each three places. Last week's Torah portion, the Parsha of Yisro, the Torah says, Vayanu kol ha'am yachdav, and the entire people responded together, and they said as one voice, Vayomru, kol asher diber Hashem nasa. Everything that God said, we will do. Period. That's one verse. Then in this week's Torah portion, Parsha Mishpatim, there's another verse. Vayan kol ha'am kol echad, and the people responded with one voice, all together. Vayomru, and they said, kol hadvarim asher diber Hashem naseh. All of the words, all the commandments that God told us, we will do them. Then we have the third verse in our Torah portion, which I read to you before. Vayomru, and they said, the Jewish people said, Kol asher diber Hashem naseh v'nishma. They said, everything that God has commanded, we will do it, and we will understand it. Now you notice the three verses are similar. The first two only mention naseh. It's only the third that says naseh v'nishma. But there's another difference. The first two verses emphasize that the entire Jewish people said these words with one voice. Naseh, unanimity, we will do it. But the verse that talks about nishma, naseh v'nishma, the pasuk doesn't say anything that they all said with one verse. They said it, not necessarily with one verse. Why is that? So Rabbi Jonathan Sachs explains that on the level of naseh, when it comes to action, we, the Jewish people, were one. We all observed the same mitzvahs. Yes, it's true, there's minor differences between Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Hasidim. There's certain differences in practice, but basically, in terms of action, we all do basically the same thing. If we're keeping God's commandments, we're keeping Shabbos, we're keeping kosher, we're observing the holidays, we're davening. In action, there is relative unanimity. We're all doing it. But when we come to Nishma, understanding it, we are not called upon to be one. We have those who understand things in a legal manner, those who understand things in a mystical manner, those people who are philosophers, those people who are poets. There are all kinds of different ways to understand what a mitzvah means, what it should mean for me. Our rabbis tell us that at Sinai, everyone received revelation in their own way, meaning the way they understood it. What unites Jews, what should unite Jews, is action. We do the same deeds, but we understand them differently. How we understand the mitzvos, what does it cause me to feel? What does it cause me to become? Each one of us will understand it in our own way. And there is no requirement that we must all agree on what it means. And with all of our commitment to the truth of our Jewish doing, we must respect and value all of our differences of understanding. And that's why Naseh v'nishma could not be said as a unanimous statement, because only the Naseh is unanimous. Nishma, we all have our own way of understanding. Okay, let's return to the question I mentioned a moment ago. The narrative of the revelation in Sinai and God speaking the Aseres Dibros, the Ten Commandments, the structure of it is very, very strange. Because the narrative is told in last week's Torah portion, the Parsha of Yisro, and then it is told in this week's Torah portion, the Parsha of Mishpatim. It's very strange. The same narrative is told twice. Now, the narrative of Sinai is a foundational narrative of Judaism. It is the direct relationship that every one of us has with God. It is the understanding that every single commandment in the Torah is a direct expression of that relationship we have with God. So how is it that we have the portion of Yisro, which tells the narrative of the revelation at Sinai, and then we have an interruption with this week's Torah portion, Ve'ela Mishpatim, which is about law and judges and crimes. And then at the end of this week's Torah portion, after the interruption, we have the telling of the narrative of Revelation again. And the key to this is that the two tellings of this narrative are parallel, but they are very different from each other. Let's take a look. In last week's Torah portion, the Parsha of Yisro begins with the preparation for this magnificent event, historic event. Vayavo midbar Sinai, vayachanu b'midbar, vayichan sham Yisrael neged ahar. They came to Sinai in front of the mountain. Vayomer Hashem Moshe lechel anashim, lechel am v'kidashtem hayom machar. Go to the people and sanctify them, have them get ready, v'heyu nechonim liyom hashlishi, and have them be ready that on the morning of the third day, that God will descend to the mountain and reveal God to the entire Jewish people. So, Moshe does that. He says to the people, we're going to get ready for 3 days, and then this is going to happen. Okay, so there's the preparation. And then there is the narrative. It was in the morning of the third day, and there was thunder, and there was lightning, and there was clouds and smoke on the mountain. There was a sound of the shofar. And the shofar kept getting louder and louder. Vayidaber Elokim es kol hadvarim ha'ela lemar, and God said all these things as follows: Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher tzeitzichem eretz Mitzrayim. I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. That's the beginning of the Aseret Dibros, the Ten Commandments. So, in the Parsha of Yisro last week, we have the preparation for this event, and then we have the revelation itself, the content of what God said to the Jewish people at that revelation, which was the Aseret Dibros, the Ten Commandments. Then there's an interruption. This week's Torah portion, Ve'ela hamishpatim asher tasim lifneihem. These are the laws and the rules that you should put before them. Judges and court and crimes and punishments. An interruption. Until finally, near the end of our Torah portion this week, the Torah says, again, retelling first the preparation for revelation. V'nigash Moshe levado el Hashem. Moshe encountered God, and then Moshe came back to tell the people everything that they were going to have to do. And then the people said, Vayomru kol asher diber Hashem nasa v'nishma, everything that God says we will do and we will hear, understand, obey. We discussed that. So that's the preparation for the revelation. And then we retell the event itself in the following words. Vayiru eis Elokei Yisrael. The entire Jewish people saw God. God revealed himself. They saw God. V'sachas raglav, and beneath God's feet, Kamase livnas hasapir, there were what appeared to be sapphire bricks. Uche'etzem hashamayim letohar, and like the essence of the clear blue sky. Okay, that's the revelation at Sinai. What does it mean? Here, We do not have the content of revelation, but the impression that revelation made. What's going on? Why are there two separate passages about the same event? So I want to explain it using the words, the ideas of Aryeh ben David. He wrote an article. He's a teacher, and he's talking about priorities in Jewish education, but I want to borrow from his writing to try to explain this. He quotes the Talmud. The Talmud says a parable, a mashal, a parable about Jewish education. Rava, that's one of the Talmudic sages, Rava said to his servant, "Did you bring the wheat up to the roof?" They would take the wheat up to the roof to dry it. "Did you bring the wheat up to the roof? Did you spread the preserving agent on it? If not, then all the wheat will simply go to waste." Okay, it's about agriculture, but it's a parable. So there are two symbols in this parable. There's the wheat, and the wheat means to represent the content of Torah learning. And there's the preserving agent. The preserving agent means to represent the awe, the reverence, the overwhelming feeling of imminence in the face of God. And what, according to Ben David, what this passage in the Talmud is teaching us is, without the preserving agent, without a sense of awe, the Torah learning will just go to waste. The wheat will just get moldy. And this is kind of similar to an idea we discussed last week when we talked about the Torah reading. Because we have to study the Torah, the content of the Torah. We have to know what it says. But while we're learning what it says, we also have to have a sense that we're learning what God tells us, what God wants. By learning God's Torah, we are connected to God. God is expressing God's will through these commandments. It's not just for us to know what to do. It's also to have this connection to God. So I should feel intellectually challenged, stimulated by what I'm learning, to know it intellectually, but I should also have a sense of awe. Amazing. I now understand something more about God, that God wants me to do this, that God doesn't want me to do this. This tells me something about the nature of God. And this relates to Torah study. It relates to Jewish education in general. And I would say it especially relates to prayer. And we've talked about this many times. When we pray, we want to say the words, the paragraphs, the ideas, yes. But those are the tools to reach the goal, because the goal of prayer is something beyond the words. It's the sense of awe of God. It's a sense of encounter with God. Knowledge without a sense of awe is not enough to sustain a Jewish identity. Let me repeat that, because I think that is so critical, especially today. Knowledge without a sense of awe is not enough to sustain a Jewish identity. If a person prays, they could say the words, they could understand the words, but if they don't have a sense of awe that by saying the words, while saying the words, they are encountering God, speaking face to face, then they're just reading. They're not praying. Rabbi Dov Singer, I've quoted to you before, wrote an incredible book on prayer. And he writes, an essential aspect of prayer is hakaras hanochach, perceiving the presence of God. You know, we talk about kavana, in prayer, kavana. Kavana in prayer. What does that mean? Sometimes we translate it as intention or consciousness. What is this intention or consciousness that we're supposed to have in prayer? It means that a person should empty his heart and of all thoughts and see themselves as if they are standing before the Shekhinah, before God's presence. The Rambam says, hear these words, they are so, so deep. The Rambam says, Maimonides, in his Laws of Prayer, prayer, even before it is a request, even before it's an expression of gratitude, even before it is praise, is an encounter. And therefore, the first step we take as we enter into prayer is the opening of consciousness to presence, to the sense that God is here. These two aspects of prayer, the words of the prayer and the sense of awe at the encounter with God, reflect the two aspects of revelation at Sinai, divided between last week's Torah portion of Yisro and this week's Torah portion of Mishpatim. Yisro is literary, it is the content, it's the knowledge of what happened and what was said, the Aseret Dibros, the Ten Commandments. And Mishpatim is about awe. Naaseh v'nishma is about trust. I agree to observe because I am filled with the awe at the encounter with God, and I have complete trust that whatever God says is for my best interest. In our own lives, we need the proper amount of both. For prayer, for Torah study, for every mitzvah. And that's why the narrative is divided into two separate Torah portions, to give the spotlight to each of these essential elements. My friends, I wish you a great night and a beautiful Shabbos, though it will be an emotional roller coaster of a Shabbos and a week to come, I fear. And I look forward to seeing you soon in person.